Outside a warm Vermont restaurant, a starving German shepherd stood in the snow, with a tiny puppy held gently in his mouth. He was shivering, exhausted, and hungry. But when food came, he pushed it toward the puppy first. Retired Coast Guard rescuer Evan Lattimer thought he was simply helping two animals survive one cold afternoon. Then he learned the old canine had walked for miles to reach one place he remembered as safe. Kelso had spent his whole life finding those who needed help, but this time he refused to leave one small life behind. And for Evan, saving the dogs would become the easy part. Learning how to stay after the rescue was over would be much harder. If this story touches you, tell us where you're watching from. And please like and subscribe as we work toward 5,000 subscribers and keep bringing you more stories like this. By noon, the storm had already become beautiful. That was the unfair thing about winter in northern Vermont. A night could bury roads, snap branches, erase fences, and make every mile dangerous. Then morning would arrive beneath a hard blue sky and turn all that difficulty into something almost peaceful. Evan Lattimer had never trusted peaceful-looking weather. He pulled his SUV into the plowed lot beside the north window grill and sat behind the wheel for several seconds before shutting off the engine. Snowbanks rose shoulder-high along the edge of the parking area. Beyond them, the white hills of the Northeast Kingdom rolled toward Lake Willoughby, their dark spruce trees standing sharp against the brightness. Sunlight bounced off the snow with enough force to make him narrow his eyes. Evan checked the time on the old marine watch strapped around his wrist. 12:17. He had allowed himself 25 minutes, enough for lunch, not enough for conversation. At 58, Evan had built a life around leaving before places expected anything from him. His inspection work made that easy. A boatyard in one town, a harbor in another, 3 nights in a motel, 5 in a rental cottage, then south again. He carried tools, 2 duffel bags, a laptop, and almost nothing that could not be loaded into the SUV in 10 minutes. People called that freedom. Evan had learned not to argue with them. Inside the north window grill, heat met him with the smell of coffee, browned butter, soup stock, and wood smoke from an old iron stove near the rear wall. The restaurant was modest and bright, built from honey-colored timber that had darkened around the knots with age. Snowlight poured through the wide front windows. A few tables were occupied by road crews, an elderly couple, and 2 men in work jackets discussing a frozen water line. Evan chose the table nearest the window. His rust-brown waxed jacket hung over the chair beside him. Under it, he wore a deep navy Henley, the sleeves pushed halfway up his forearms. His shoulders still carried the broad shape of a man who had spent most of his adult life fighting water, though age had pulled some heaviness away from the muscle and left strength that looked more practical than impressive. His hair, brown-gray and longer on top, refused to stay neatly in place after he ran a hand through it. A short salt and pepper beard covered his jaw. He ordered tomato beef soup and a grilled sandwich. The woman who brought it introduced herself only because Evan had asked whether the road south was open. "Maeve Holleran," she said, setting the bowl down. And yes, technically. She was somewhere in her early 60s, sturdy rather than heavy, with auburn hair threaded with silver and tied loosely at the back of her neck. A canvas apron covered a dark green flannel shirt. A red and white kitchen towel was tucked through the apron tie at her hip. "Technically?" Evan asked. "Means the plows have seen it. Doesn't mean they've forgiven it." That earned half a smile from him. Maeve noticed, but politely acted as though she had not. Evan ate facing the window. He liked restaurants where no one expected him to perform friendliness. The north window seemed to understand that kind of customer. Plates moved, coffee poured, boots stamped snow from their soles. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, someone laughed too loudly. For a few minutes, Evan allowed himself the comfort of being no one important. Then a woman at the next table stopped speaking. Her fork remained halfway to her mouth. "Oh, Lord." The words were quiet enough that Evan almost ignored them. Then she pointed toward the window. Every head nearby turned. Something stood outside on the white edge of the parking lot. At first, Evan saw only the German Shepherd, large male, black and gold, long-legged, head carried lower than it should have been. Then he saw what the dog was carrying. A puppy. Small enough that its cinnamon-colored body seemed almost lost beneath the shepherd's muzzle. The restaurant changed without anyone deciding it should. Chairs scraped. Someone stood. Maeve came around the counter quickly. The shepherd reached the narrow strip beneath the front awning and lowered the puppy with astonishing care. Not dropped. Lowered. The little body folded against the packed snow. The shepherd immediately turned sideways and stood between the puppy and the wind. Evan stopped eating. There were things the body recognized before the mind found language for them. Exhaustion was one. The dog's ribs were not sharply exposed, but the line behind his chest narrowed too much. His black saddle looked dull from damp and road grime. Snow had clumped between the toes of his paws. Even through the glass, Evan could see small tremors running through the back legs. Yet the shepherd remained standing, not because standing was easy, because the puppy was on the ground. Maeve was already moving toward the kitchen. "Charlie, warm water, not hot, and give me some of that roast beef." One of the men near the counter started toward the front door. Evan looked at him. Slow. The man stopped. Maybe it was Evan's tone. Maybe it was the way he said it without raising his voice. Maeve returned with 2 shallow bowls and glanced at him. "You know dogs?" Enough to know 6 people walking at him won't help. Maeve nodded once, no argument. That made Evan like her more. They stepped outside together. Cold hit immediately. The air had sharpened since Evan entered the restaurant, and a loose veil of powder was beginning to skim across the parking lot as wind moved over the snowbanks. The shepherd watched them. His eyes were bright golden amber. Old eyes, Evan thought, not clouded, experienced. There was a narrow cream gold marking down the center of the dog's chest, shaped almost like a flame. A weathered oxblood leather collar circled his neck. No leash. Maeve crouched several yards away. "Easy, sweetheart." The shepherd's ears moved forward. Evan noticed it immediately. Not the word sweetheart. The word easy. Maeve placed the food on the snow and backed away. The dog smelled the roast beef. For 1 second, hunger appeared nakedly across his entire body. His nostrils widened, his head lowered. Then he turned away from the bowl. Evan frowned. Maeve moved the food closer to the puppy. The shepherd stepped forward. Evan thought he might take it. Instead, the dog put his nose against the rim and pushed the bowl several inches until it touched the puppy's front paws. The puppy stirred, barely. A small, dark nose lifted from the snow. Maeve inhaled through her teeth. "That settles it." "What?" "I already hated whoever let them get like this." Evan kept his eyes on the shepherd. "Doesn't mean anyone did." Maeve looked at him. "Always this cheerful?" "Only before lunch." The puppy made an attempt to lick at the softened meat. The shepherd watched. Only after the puppy swallowed twice did the larger dog lower himself toward the second bowl. Before his mouth reached it, Maeve shifted closer, intending to lift the puppy away from the snow. The shepherd moved faster than Evan expected. 1 step, then another. His body came between Maeve and the puppy. No growl, no teeth, no raised hackles, just a barrier. Maeve froze. The shepherd froze with her. Evan saw the distinction immediately. This was not a dog looking for a fight. It was a dog enforcing a boundary. "Stay," Evan said. The shepherd's head turned. The response was small but unmistakable. He held position. Evan felt something tighten behind his ribs. Easy. One ear shifted again. Maeve slowly stood. "Well," she said, That's not a stray. No. You recognize the collar? No. But he recognizes commands. He recognizes more than that. Evan did not explain. He set his gloves on the hood of a parked car and walked several yards away from Maeve before lowering himself onto the snow. His knees complained. He ignored them. The cold immediately soaked through the outer layer of his work pants. He placed one bare hand on his raised knee. Then he did nothing. It was a skill people rarely associated with rescue work. Waiting. Not every emergency was improved by rushing toward it. The shepherd stared at him. The puppy ate another small mouthful. Evan remained where he was. Wind moved a strand of hair across his forehead. His beard caught tiny crystals of blown snow. The dog's breathing was visible, slow, heavy, measured. Minutes passed. People watched from inside the restaurant, their faces softened by the window glass. Evan became aware of the sandwich cooling on his table. Then the shepherd stepped toward him. Only one pace. Stopped. Another. Stopped again. Close enough now for Evan to see the narrow golden break in the dog's black saddle near the rear of his back, a V-shaped interruption in the dark coat. The dog did not sniff Evan's hand. He looked at his face, then looked back at the puppy. That was all. But something about it landed harder than a plea would have. Evan had spent 27 years around people who needed immediate answers. Water did not wait. Cold did not negotiate. A sinking vessel did not care whether the rescuer had other plans. This was different. No alarm, no radio, no command. Only a dog standing in the snow, visibly failing by inches, and still placing another life ahead of his own. Evan rose. The shepherd tensed, but did not retreat. "I'm getting a blanket," Evan said, though he had no reason to explain himself to a dog. He turned toward his SUV. After several steps, he heard the faint crunch of snow behind him. He looked back. The shepherd had followed. 2 steps, no more. His legs shook. Then he stopped and looked over his shoulder toward the puppy. Evan stood beside the SUV with one hand on the rear door. The meaning was not mystical. He did not imagine the dog understood cars, veterinarians, or what kind of man Evan was. But the pattern was clear enough. The shepherd wanted to move. He would not move without the puppy. Evan opened the SUV. Under his tool case was an old fleece blanket he used to protect equipment from frost. When he returned, Maeve was waiting beside the puppy. "This yours?" she asked. "Was." "That sounds expensive." "It's a blanket." People get sentimental about stranger things. Together they worked slowly. Maeve brought out a soft-sided produce crate from the kitchen storage room and lined it with folded towels. Evan placed the fleece over them. He did not reach for the puppy until the shepherd saw every movement. Easy. The dog watched. Evan slid one hand beneath the puppy's chest and the other beneath its hindquarters. The small body was frighteningly light. Warm enough to be alive, too cold to be comfortable. He placed her in the crate. The shepherd immediately came forward. His nose touched the edge. The puppy shifted weakly beneath the blanket. Only then did the shepherd's shoulders drop, a fraction. It was the first surrender Evan had seen from him. Maeve looked toward the SUV. "There's a veterinary clinic 10 minutes east." Evan checked his watch. 12:54. His appointment south was already becoming impossible. His phone showed 2 missed calls from the marina. Evan stared at the screen. For years, his life had depended on schedules because schedules were uncomplicated. You arrived, you inspected, you signed, you moved on. Behind him, nails scraped lightly against packed snow. The shepherd had made it to the rear passenger door. Evan opened it. The dog looked inside at the crate, then at Evan. He did not jump. He seemed too tired. Evan put one arm beneath the shepherd's chest and another around his hindquarters. The dog stiffened for half a second, then allowed himself to be lifted. Heavy, much heavier than the puppy. Still lighter than a German shepherd his size should have been. Evan settled him beside the crate. The shepherd immediately lowered his head until his muzzle rested against the blanket covering the puppy. Maeve closed the door carefully. Evan stood outside the SUV. Snow moved across the lot in thin silver streaks. "You going to call your appointment?" Maeve asked. "Yes." "Cancel?" Evan looked through the glass. The shepherd's eyes were already closing, but one paw remained pressed against the crate. "Delay." Maeve smiled faintly. "Of course." Evan put on his gloves. He had known these animals for less than an hour. He did not know their names, did not know where they had come from, did not know whether anyone was looking for them. He knew only that one of them had reached a warm building and still refused to save himself first. Evan started the engine. As the heater came alive, the shepherd lifted his head just enough to check the crate. Then he let it fall again. Evan watched him in the mirror. "Veterinarian," he said quietly. The word sounded temporary. Good. Temporary was something Evan understood. He pulled out of the North Window Grill parking lot and turned east through the bright winter afternoon. He told himself he was only taking 2 dogs somewhere warm, nothing more. For the moment he believed it. The veterinary clinic sat on a side street where the plows had pushed snow into hard white walls along the curb. By the time Evan carried the crate through the front door, the brightness outside had started fading into the pale blue of late afternoon. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant, wet wool, and the dusty sweetness of dog treats kept in a glass jar near the counter. Kelso refused to let the crate out of sight. He was too weak to resist Evan lifting him from the SUV, but once his paws touched the rubber floor, he planted himself beside Juniper and stayed there. A woman emerged from the back hallway while pulling on a pair of examination gloves. "Which one concerns you more?" Evan looked down. "The large one." "Good answer." Dr. Corinne Vale did not waste time with introductions until both animals were inside an examination room. She was 52, lean, quick-moving, with dark chestnut hair cut in a practical bob that kept falling forward whenever she bent over the table. A few silver strands showed near one temple. She wore deep teal scrubs under a warm gray veterinary jacket, and her rectangular reading glasses were pushed onto the top of her head. Her manner was calm without being soft. Evan recognized the type. People who worked around emergencies long enough eventually stopped decorating bad news. Corinne examined Juniper first. The puppy was alert enough to protest being handled, which Corinne seemed to consider encouraging. She checked gums, temperature, abdomen, hydration, ears, paws, then listened to her chest. "About 11 or 12 weeks, she said. "Maybe a little younger, but not by much." "She going to make it?" Corinne glanced at Evan. "Unless she surprises me in a bad way, yes." Evan had not realized how tightly he had been standing until some of the tension left his shoulders. "Underfed, dehydrated, too cold for too long. But she's eaten recently." Evan looked toward the puppy. "How recently?" "Not today only. I mean over the last several days. A puppy this age doesn't stay upright through a Vermont storm on melted snow and determination." Kelso stood on the floor beside the table. At the sound of Juniper moving, his ears lifted. Corinne noticed. His turn. Getting Kelso onto the padded table required both of them. He did not object. That somehow made the effort feel worse. A dog his size should have made Evan work harder. Under the damp black and gold coat, there was less body than there should have been. The deep chest was still impressive, but the muscles around the hips had thinned.
Corinne ran experienced hands along his spine, legs, abdomen, and shoulders. Kelso watched her face. Not fearful, assessing. "Working dog," Corinne said. "You can tell? Besides the fact he thinks he's supervising the exam?" Evan looked at Kelso. Corinne lifted one paw.
The pads were rough, reddened around the edges, with packed ice having irritated the skin between the toes. Nothing torn badly, no fracture, no deep cuts. "Long travel," she said. "Several days at least, probably more." "On those feet?" Dogs will do unreasonable things when they believe they have a reason. She checked his hydration, listened to his heart, then stepped back. "He's lucky." Evan almost objected to the word. Corinne seemed to read it on his face. "I didn't say comfortable. He's lost weight. He's exhausted, and I want blood work. But there's no major injury I can find. No obvious infection. No sign he was struck by a vehicle." She looked toward Juniper. "He spent himself getting somewhere." Evan rested a hand against the edge of the table. "Can you check a chip?" Corinne was already reaching for the scanner. The device passed over Kelso's shoulders once. Nothing. A second pass. A beep. There it was. Numbers appeared on the small display. Corinne wrote them down, removed her gloves, and crossed to the computer. Evan remained by Kelso. The shepherd's head had lowered, but he was still watching the crate on the other side of the room. Juniper made a small sound in her sleep. Kelso's eyes opened wider. "You're going to wear yourself out doing that," Evan said under his breath. The dog did not look at him. Corinne typed for several minutes, then stopped. "Well?" Evan turned. "What?" She read the screen again. "His name is Kelso." The dog's head came up. Evan noticed it. So did Corinne. She said the name again, quieter. "Kelso." Both ears moved forward. For the first time since the restaurant, the shepherd's expression changed in a way Evan could not explain through body language alone. Not excitement, not relief. Recognition. The name belonged to him. Corinne continued reading. 9 years old, German Shepherd, registered to Walter Fenwick. She scrolled. Search and Rescue Certification, Civilian SAR Unit. Wilderness Search, Winter Tracking, Missing Person Recovery. Evan looked at the dog again. The discipline suddenly had context. "What's the address?" Corinne gave him a look. "Before we start driving anywhere, we call." The first number went straight to a disconnected recording. The second belonged to a landline at the old Fenwick address. No answer. Corinne searched further, then called the county contact attached to the registration record. The process took time. Evan hated waiting rooms when there was nothing useful to do. He sat, stood, walked to the window, checked his phone. The marina had called again. He sent a message explaining that weather had delayed him. It was not exactly a lie. When Corinne finally returned from the back office, she carried a yellow notepad with 3 names written across it. Walter Fenwick is alive. Evan did not know why he had assumed otherwise until she said it. Where is he? An assisted living community north of here. He had hip surgery last year, then another fall this fall. According to the administrator, he moved there permanently. And Kelso? That's where it gets complicated. She tapped the second name. 3 weeks ago, Walter arranged for a friend to take Kelso. Before Evan could ask more, Corinne's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Maybe that friend. She answered. The conversation was short, mostly listening. When she hung up, her expression had changed. Not alarm, something more personal. He's coming. Who? Graham Pritch. Kelso shifted at the name, but Evan could not tell whether it meant anything. They waited another 40 minutes. Juniper received warmed fluids and a small amount of food. Kelso was given water in controlled portions, then a little easily digested meat. He ate this time, slowly, but only after Evan moved Juniper's crate close enough for him to see inside. At 4:30, the clinic door opened hard enough to ring the bell twice. A man stepped inside, carrying cold air with him. Graham Pritch was 64, broad through the torso and slightly heavier around the middle than a man who had once spent weekends hiking search grids probably wanted to admit. His gray-blonde hair had receded deeply at the temples, and a short gray goatee sharpened a face otherwise softened by fatigue. He wore a faded tan insulated work jacket over a navy hoodie, carpenter jeans, and boots crusted with salt. He saw Evan first, then Corinne, then Kelso. Graham stopped. Every part of his body seemed to forget what it had been doing. Oh, that was all. Kelso lifted his head. Graham took one step, then stopped himself. Kelso! The shepherd knew him. There was no question. His ears came forward, his body shifted, the tail moved once against the floor. But he did not get up. Graham lowered himself carefully to one knee. I'm sorry, boy. His voice changed on the last word. Evan looked away for a moment, not because Graham was crying. He was not. The apology simply sounded too private for strangers. I'm sorry, Graham said again. I should have checked that gate twice. Kelso watched him. Graham reached out but stopped several inches from the dog's face. Kelso leaned forward and touched his nose to Graham's knuckles. Graham shut his eyes. For one brief second, the whole search seemed to end there. Then Juniper shifted in the crate. Kelso's head turned immediately. The movement was so abrupt that Graham opened his eyes. He followed the dog's gaze. That the puppy? Came in with him, Corinne said. Graham stared at Juniper. I've never seen that dog in my life. Evan leaned against the counter. What happened when Kelso went missing? Graham stood slowly. Walter brought him over himself. Well, his niece drove. We'd talked about it for weeks. His words came quickly now, as if speed might make them easier. I volunteered SAR with Walt years ago, not like he did. I was mostly logistics and ground team. Kelso knew me. My place has acreage. Heated mudroom, fenced run. Thought it would be easy. He rubbed both hands over his face. Storm coming in that afternoon. I was moving feed and firewood. The side gate hadn't latched clean. Wind caught it. Kelso ran. Ran like he knew exactly where he was going. Graham gave a humorless laugh. I figured he'd circle back. Then I figured he'd head for Walter's old place. Then the snow started. He described the search. Neighbors on snowmobiles, county deputies, volunteers, flyers at gas stations, feed stores, shelters. A social media post shared through 3 towns. For 4 days they found possible tracks, then the storm buried everything. After day 10, Graham said, people started talking different. Evan knew what he meant. Hope had grammar. So did resignation. They never told Walter we'd stopped looking, Graham continued. We didn't stop, exactly, just there wasn't anywhere left to search that made sense. He looked at Kelso again. I thought I'd killed his dog by being careless. Corinne crossed her arms. You didn't. Graham nodded as though he accepted the logic, but not the absolution. I want to take him home. The statement came fast, too fast. Kelso's ears shifted. Graham moved toward him. At that same moment, Corinne lifted Juniper's crate onto the examination table. I need one more wait before she settles for the evening. She carried the puppy toward the adjoining room. Kelso rose, his front legs locked, his hind legs trembled violently. Kelso? Graham said. The dog ignored him. Corinne crossed the doorway. Kelso tried to follow. His paws slipped on the rubber floor. Evan caught the support strap beneath his chest before he fell. Easy. Kelso's breathing accelerated. No bark, no growl, nothing dramatic. That was what made it unsettling. The dog looked as if an invisible line had been pulled tight through his whole body. Corinne immediately turned around. She brought Juniper back. The moment the crate touched the floor, Kelso leaned toward it. His breathing slowed. Graham stared. He wasn't like this before. No, Corinne said. He probably wasn't. What is it? Attachment under prolonged stress, protective fixation, call it several things. Corinne crouched between Graham and Kelso. If he spent days keeping that puppy alive, his nervous system may have stopped believing anyone else will do it. Graham's expression changed. But I'm familiar. To him, yes. And she isn't. Apparently, she became his responsibility. The word responsibility sat heavily in the room. Evan felt it more than he wanted to. Graham looked from Kelso to Juniper. If I take both, no. Corinne did not soften it. You came prepared for one retired German Shepherd, not an underweight puppy needing observation, and right now Kelso needs rest, not another abrupt move. Graham's shoulders sagged. Walter can't take him back? No. The shelters?
Full enough that I'm already improvising.
Corinne turned her attention to Evan. He recognized the look immediately. No. I haven't asked anything. You were going to. You have a vehicle large enough for both. No. You handled Kelso correctly. For 40 minutes. You're staying nearby. For now. And the cottage you're renting allows dogs. Maeve called while you were outside moving your SUV. Evan stared at her. She called you? She likes solving problems. So do you, apparently. Yes. Graham looked between them. I can pay for food, vet bills, anything. This isn't about money, Evan said. That came out sharper than intended. He checked his watch, then the phone in his pocket, then the two animals. His life had a shape. Work south, a reservation, a schedule, a road. He liked roads because they only ask that you continue moving. I'm not fostering two dogs. Corinne nodded. All right. The lack of argument irritated him more than resistance would have. She began filling out paperwork. Graham sat beside Kelso. Juniper slept. 5 minutes passed. Evan finally said, You're not going to try again? Corinne kept writing. No. You looked like you had a speech ready. I don't give speeches. She signed one page, then looked at him. If you leave tonight, Kelso will survive. Evan's jaw tightened. So will the puppy. Yes. Then what are we talking about? Corinne set down the pen. When you drive away tonight, what do you think that dog will understand happened? Evan looked toward Kelso. The shepherd had lowered himself beside Juniper's crate, not touching it, just close enough. Graham sat on the opposite side, his hand resting uselessly in his lap. Evan wanted to say dogs did not understand abandonment in human language. That projection was dangerous, that feelings were not plans. Instead, he remembered Kelso following him 2 steps through the snow, then turning back. A body exhausted enough to shake. Still checking whether someone smaller had been left behind. Evan exhaled. How long? Corinne's eyebrows rose slightly. Emergency foster? How long? 3 nights would get us through the immediate medical observation. After that, we reassess. 3. Graham started to speak. Evan held up one finger. 3 nights. Corinne pulled another form from the clipboard. You'll need feeding instructions. 3 nights. Medication schedule? Corinne. She looked up. 3 nights, Evan repeated. This time she almost smiled. I heard you. An hour later, Evan stood beside his SUV while Graham loaded bags of food into the rear compartment. Juniper's crate was secured across the back seat. Kelso sat beside it, wrapped in a clean clinic blanket, head resting near the mesh door. Graham closed the hatch. "I owe you." "No, I do." "You don't know me." "Neither does Kelso." Evan glanced through the window. "That doesn't seem to stop him." Graham looked at the dog for a long moment. "When Walter hears he's alive..." His voice faded. Evan did not answer. Some reunions were too large to borrow in advance. He climbed behind the wheel. Corinne tapped once on the passenger window and handed him a sheet of instructions. "Warmth, small meals, short bathroom breaks, no stairs if you can avoid them. And 3 nights." "Yes, Evan." He started the engine. In the mirror, Kelso's eyes opened. The shepherd looked first toward the crate, then toward the windshield, then settled again. Evan pulled away from the clinic. His inspection appointment was gone for the day. His quiet rental cottage was no longer going to be quiet. His schedule had been rearranged by a dog he had met at lunch and a puppy whose name he did not yet know. 3 nights, he told himself. It was not commitment, it was logistics. And logistics, unlike promises, had an end date. The cottage looked different with 2 dogs in it. Nothing had actually changed. The same narrow kitchen opened into the same living room. The same pine table stood beneath the same window overlooking a buried fence line. Evan's half-unpacked duffel still rested beside the bedroom door. His inspection case sat under the coat hooks. 3 shirts hung from the back of a chair because he had never bothered using the closet. There were no photographs on the walls. No books except a Tide manual and an old paperback left by a previous renter. Nothing that said a man had decided to live there. Only that one had stopped for a while. Now there were 2 stainless steel bowls near the radiator, a bag of puppy food on the counter, a folded clinic sheet held beneath a salt shaker so Evan would remember feeding times, and a German shepherd stretched across half the floor as though he had been assigned responsibility for the room. Temporary, Evan told him. Kelso did not appear impressed. The first night was mostly logistics. Evan placed Juniper's bed near the heater and Kelso's several feet away, giving each animal enough space to rest without being crowded. For 10 minutes the arrangement worked. Then Evan went to brush his teeth. When he returned, Kelso had hooked one corner of his blanket with his teeth and dragged it halfway across the floor. Evan stared. Kelso dragged again. The blanket moved another foot toward Juniper. "You have got to be kidding me." Kelso stopped. His amber eyes met Evan's. Then he pulled once more until his front paws were nearly touching the edge of the puppy's bed. Juniper, oblivious to the debate, slept with her chin tucked against one cream-colored paw. Evan moved Kelso's water bowl closer and let the matter go. At 2 in the morning, Juniper made a small, distressed sound. Kelso was awake before Evan was fully conscious. The shepherd's head rose instantly. His body remained on the blanket, but every line of him changed. Evan sat up on the couch. Juniper shifted, sneezed, then settled again. Kelso watched until her breathing evened out. Only then did he lower his head. Evan lay back down. He stayed awake another 40 minutes. Not because the dogs were noisy, because they were not. The cottage had never seemed silent before. Now every small sound meant something. A puppy breathing, a dog repositioning an injured paw, the radiator clicking, the soft scrape of a collar buckle against the floor. By morning, Evan was irritated by all of them. Mostly because irritation was easier than admitting he had checked Juniper's breathing twice during the night. He followed Corinne's feeding instructions exactly. Small portions, warm water, no rich food. Kelso ate slowly, stopping after nearly every mouthful to look toward Juniper's bowl. "Eat." Kelso looked back at him. "You are the one who needs calories." The dog lowered his head, took another bite, then paused again when Juniper shifted. Evan's patience snapped. "You have to eat for yourself first." The words came out harder than he intended. Kelso froze. Evan did too. For 1 second, he was not in a Vermont cottage. He was 29 again, soaked through in an orange rescue suit, sitting beneath fluorescent light at a Coast Guard station while an older chief shoved a mug of coffee toward him after a winter recovery. "You cannot keep going into the water empty, Lattimer. Eat first, sleep first. You are no good to anyone if you go under too." Evan looked away from Kelso. Fine. He sat at the table and poured coffee. The memory bothered him because it had been good advice. Good advice had never been his problem. Living by it had. For 27 years, the Coast Guard had given Evan a clear relationship with human need. Someone was in danger. You went. You stabilized what you could. You got them out. Then someone else took over. Medics, families, investigators, harbor crews, the next shift. There was always a handoff. Evan had been exceptional at the part before the handoff. His marriage had failed almost entirely in the part after. His phone buzzed on the table. Marianne. He almost let it ring out, then answered. "You still alive?" she asked. "Apparently." "You sound disappointed." "I have 2 dogs." Silence. Then a short laugh. Not mocking, pure surprise. Marianne Lattimer had always laughed like that when Evan unintentionally said something absurd in a serious tone. "How did that happen?" "It is temporary." "That was not my question." Evan leaned back in the chair. Through the window, morning sunlight turned the snow-covered field almost blue-white. He told her the simplified version. Restaurant, cold dog, puppy, veterinarian, 3-night foster. Marianne listened without interrupting. She was 57 now, living 2 states away, and whatever anger had once existed between them had been worn smooth by years. They spoke occasionally, birthdays, holidays, news about mutual friends. They had long since stopped trying to repair anything. That made honesty easier. "You volunteered?" she asked. "I was cornered." "By whom?" "A veterinarian." "Terrifying." "Very." Marianne laughed again. Evan looked toward Kelso. The dog was finally eating. Juniper had fallen asleep with her nose against the side of the bowl. "Do you remember," Marianne said after a moment, "what I told you when I moved out?" Evan's hand tightened slightly around the coffee mug. "I remember plenty." "That means yes." He did not answer. Marianne's voice softened, but not with pity. "You always knew what to do on someone's worst day." Evan closed his eyes briefly. "But you never knew what to do with an ordinary one." The sentence had hurt more 20 years ago. Now it simply fit. Kelso lifted his head from the bowl. Evan watched the dog check Juniper again. "What if there is no difference?" Evan asked. "Between what?" "The worst day and the ordinary ones." Marianne was quiet. "There is," she said. "On the worst day, people are grateful you showed up. On ordinary days, you have to decide to keep showing up without being needed." Evan stared at the steam rising from his coffee. "That sounds exhausting." It was. There was no cruelty in the answer. That made it land harder. They spoke for another minute, about nothing important. Then Marianne wished him luck with the dogs. Evan hung up and remained at the table. Across the room, Kelso finally finished his food. A small victory. No applause. No rescue helicopter. No one bleeding into freezing water. Just breakfast. And for some reason, Evan found it harder to know what to do with. Later that morning, Maeve called. She had been asking around. A snowplow driver named Dale Mercer remembered seeing a large German shepherd on a county road several days before the restaurant incident. More importantly, he remembered a puppy. Evan left Kelso and Juniper resting under the arrangement Corinne had approved. Graham agreed to stop by midway through the day to check them, and Evan drove back toward the North Window Grill. Dale was waiting beside his municipal plow in the parking lot. He was around 60, narrow through the shoulders but tough-looking, with wind-burned cheeks, a white mustache, and the permanently squinting eyes of someone who had spent half his life staring through blowing snow. "I figured it was somebody's farm dog," Dale said. "When?" 8, maybe 9 days ago," he pointed north, "near the old Green Lantern Resort." Maeve stood beside Evan in her dark moss barn coat, arms folded against the cold. "You saw the puppy then?" Dale nodded. "Little thing kept walking inside the big dog's tracks." Evan looked at him. "Inside?" "Snow was deeper off the road. Shepherd broke the path. Pup followed wherever his feet had already gone." Dale demonstrated with 2 gloved fingers in the air. "Big dog would walk 20 yards, stop, look back, wait, then go again." That image followed Evan all the way to the abandoned resort. Graham met them there. The Green Lantern had once been a summer lodge overlooking a narrow lake. Now its cabins were boarded, picnic tables buried in snow, and a weathered sign leaned toward the road beneath a cap of ice. They searched only the accessible outbuildings. The maintenance shed was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of old plywood, engine oil, mouse droppings, and cold dust. Maeve found the blanket first. It had been pulled from a shelf and bunched into a rough nest behind a stack of lawn chairs. Beside it sat a faded plastic bowl. Graham crouched near several torn bags stored against the wall. "Pet food." Some were old bags of kibble intended for the caretaker's barn cats. Mice had opened one corner months ago. Another tear was different, higher, rougher. Evan ran a finger along the punctures. Tooth marks. Graham looked toward the nest. He found food, enough for a while. Maeve picked up a small plastic scoop. Not forever. The story of the previous days began arranging itself without anyone having to dramatize it. Shelter, food, cold, a large dog capable of opening a damaged bag, a puppy small enough to fit against his body for warmth. No secret compartment, no hidden message, nothing waiting beneath the floorboards, just survival made from ordinary things, a blanket, a bowl, a torn sack of food. A man arrived from the caretaker's house farther down the property after seeing their vehicles. His name was Howard Lyle, a seasonal groundskeeper in his late 50s who checked the resort twice a week during winter. When Maeve showed him a phone photo of Juniper, recognition came slowly. "There was a female around here before the season closed." "What kind?" Evan asked. "Mixed breed, brown, smaller than the shepherd." "Puppies?" "I saw her carrying something under the deck once. Could have been." Howard rubbed his chin. "After the storm, she stopped showing up." No one asked him to guess what happened. There was no need. "And the shepherd?" Graham asked. "Never saw him before this month." Evan stepped outside. From the maintenance shed, the road south was visible through the bare trees. He took out his phone and opened the map. Graham came beside him. "The farm is about 7 miles that way," Graham said, pointing northwest. Evan traced the route. Kelso could have been trying to return somewhere familiar when he found Juniper. Maybe he had stopped for 1 night, then stayed for 2, then 3, until staying became the new task. Maeve joined them. "North Window is, what, 11 miles from here by road?" 12 and change, Evan said. "Less if you cut through old trails." Graham looked over the snowy ridge. Kelso knew trails. Evan looked back at the shed. He thought of Dale's description, the German shepherd breaking a path, waiting, breaking another, waiting again. He had assumed Kelso's journey ended at the restaurant because exhaustion finally forced him toward people. But that explanation was no longer enough. There were houses closer than the north window, a gas station, a farm supply store, a sheriff's substation farther east. Kelso had passed places where food might have been easier. He had chosen a specific direction. Evan folded the phone back into his pocket. Maeve watched him. What? Nothing. That is usually what people say when it is something. Evan glanced toward the distant road. He knew where he was going. Graham's expression tightened. To Walter? No. Walter lived too far north now, and the old Fenwick home was in another direction. Evan looked at Maeve. The restaurant. Her face changed slightly. Not recognition exactly, more like a memory trying to surface. But she shook her head. I'll think about it. Evan nodded. He did not push. The day had already given him enough. On the drive back to the cottage, he kept seeing the maintenance shed. Not as tragedy, as evidence of routine. Kelso had found food, made shelter, waited for Juniper to walk, stayed when continuing alone would have been easier. Evan had spent most of his life believing emergencies revealed character because they stripped away choice. Now he was beginning to wonder if the opposite was true. Maybe character showed most clearly after the immediate danger passed, when nobody was giving orders, when leaving became possible. He pulled into the cottage driveway near dusk. Graham's truck was gone. A note was tucked beneath the door handle. Both fed. Puppy peed on your rug. Kelso watched me clean it up like a disappointed supervisor. G. Evan read it twice, then laughed despite himself. Inside, Juniper was asleep. Kelso lay beside her. For once, his head was down. Not watching. Actually resting. Evan removed his jacket quietly. On the kitchen table, he spread out the road map. His finger moved from Graham's farm to the abandoned resort, then toward North Window Grill. The route was long, but possible, especially for a trained search dog that knew the country. The question was no longer how Kelso had reached the restaurant. Evan understood enough of that now. The question was why. After hunger, cold, exhaustion, and miles of winter road, Kelso had decided that one particular building was where the journey should end. He looked toward the sleeping shepherd. Why there? Kelso did not move. Evan had no expectation that he would. For the first time since meeting the dog, Evan was not asking what needed to be done next. He was asking what had mattered enough for Kelso to remember. Nearly a week after the afternoon at North Window Grill, Kelso was strong enough for the trip north. Not healthy enough to forget what had happened to him. Not strong enough to move like the working dog he had once been. But the trembling in his legs had eased. His appetite had improved, and the hollowness along his flanks had begun to soften beneath the black and gold coat. Evan helped him into the SUV using the support harness Corinne had provided. Juniper was not coming. Corinne had suggested keeping the puppy at the clinic for several hours, both for a routine follow-up and because Kelso needed to begin learning that Juniper could disappear from view without disappearing from his life. Kelso had not liked the arrangement. At the clinic, he had stood facing the door after Corinne carried Juniper into the back room. No barking, no pulling, just stillness so concentrated that Evan could almost feel it. "She'll be there when we get back," Evan had said. Corinne, standing beside him, had answered quietly, "He doesn't know that yet." Now Kelso lay across the rear seat of the SUV with his head raised toward the window, watching snow-covered fields slide past. Graham sat beside Evan. Maeve followed in her own truck. The assisted living community where Walter Fenwick lived stood on a low hill north of St. Johnsbury, overlooking a frozen pond and several acres of white pasture. The buildings were painted cream with dark green trim. Bird feeders hung outside wide windows. A row of raised garden beds slept beneath the snow. It did not look sad. Evan realized he had expected it to. That bothered him. Graham barely spoke after they parked. For most of the drive, he had filled the silence with unnecessary details: road conditions, the price of heating oil, a broken hinge in his barn. Now he simply stood beside the SUV, staring at the building. "You haven't seen Walter since Kelso went missing," Evan said. Graham shook his head. "Couldn't make myself come." "Why?" Graham looked at him as if the answer were obvious. "Because he trusted me with one thing that mattered." Evan did not tell him that one mistake did not erase years of friendship. He suspected Graham had already heard every reasonable version of that sentence. Some guilt survived logic because logic had never created it. Maeve joined them carrying a brown paper bag. "Coffee cake," she said. Graham looked at her. "This a reunion or a church basement?" "Same food either way." That loosened something in him, only slightly. Inside, a receptionist led them through a common room warmed by an electric fireplace. Two elderly men played cards near the window. A woman knitted beside a shelf of paperbacks. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a television audience applauded something no one in the room seemed to be watching. Walter Fenwick waited in a smaller sitting area overlooking the hills. Evan recognized him immediately from old photographs Graham had shown him, though time had redrawn nearly every line. Walter was 67, with a square face that had grown leaner around the cheeks, close-cut white hair, and a thick gray-white mustache. He wore an oatmeal cardigan over a navy and tan flannel shirt. A honey-colored ash cane rested against his knee. A folded walker stood beside the wall. His shoulders were still broad. His body simply no longer trusted them to carry everything alone. Walter saw Graham first, then Maeve. Then Kelso came through the doorway. Walter's hand slipped from the cane. Kelso stopped. No one called him. No one needed to. The German shepherd stood completely still, ears lifted, mouth closed, amber eyes fixed on the man across the room. Walter gripped the chair arms and lowered himself as far forward as his hip allowed. "Hey, old man." Kelso walked to him, not quickly. He seemed to know that speed would cheapen something. When he reached Walter, he placed his head on the man's knee. Walter's hands settled behind his ears, and the room went quiet. Graham turned his face toward the window. Maeve lowered the paper bag onto a side table. Evan stayed near the door. He had witnessed reunions after rescues before. People running down docks, families breaking into tears before the helicopter doors opened, hands reaching for whatever had almost been taken from them. This was nothing like that. Walter and Kelso did not look as though they had found each other again. They looked as though they had resumed a conversation interrupted halfway through. Walter rubbed the fur beneath Kelso's jaw. "You look awful." Kelso leaned harder against him. Walter smiled. "So do I. Fair enough." Maeve laughed softly. Graham did not. He stepped closer. "Walt." Walter looked up. Graham's mouth worked once before sound came. "I'm sorry." Walter's expression did not harden. That almost made it worse. "I should have checked the gate." "I should have. Graham. I lost him." "You left a gate unlatched." The result was the same. Walter glanced down at Kelso. "No." Graham stared at him. Walter scratched the dog's neck. "The result is sitting on my foot." Graham's eyes reddened. He nodded once. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was permission to stop making punishment useful. They moved into the room. Kelso settled beside Walter's chair, but every few minutes his head turned toward the hallway. Evan noticed. Walter did too.
The puppy isn't here? At Corinne's, Evan said. A few hours. Walter watched Kelso listening toward the door. He attached to her that hard? Hard enough that we're trying to teach him she can be safe without him seeing her. Walter gave a small, unsurprised grunt. That sounds like Kelso. Evan leaned against the window ledge. You've seen it before? Not with a puppy. Walter rested both hands on the top of his cane. But the behavior, yes.
That was how Evan finally learned what Kelso had been like when he was working. Not through medals, not through certificates. Walter barely mentioned accomplishments. Kelso had been a good wilderness search dog because he was patient and persistent. He could work a cold scent over rough terrain without wasting energy. He was steady around frightened people. But he had one habit Walter had never managed to train out of him. He hated leaving somebody who wasn't okay yet, Walter said. Maeve sat opposite him. What do you mean? Finding somebody doesn't always finish a search. Sometimes medical takes them and you keep moving. Sometimes there are 2 people missing and you've only found 1. Walter looked down at Kelso. One winter we found a hiker after 12 hours, hypothermic, confused. Medical team had him wrapped and loaded onto a litter. We still had another subject somewhere above the tree line. So you gave Kelso another search command, Evan said. I gave him the move on command. Walter's mustache shifted with a faint smile. He sat down. Maeve laughed. Refused? Completely. Walter demonstrated with his cane. I told him again. He looked at the medics, looked at me, sat harder somehow. And the third command? Evan asked. I walked away. Walter's voice softened. He followed. Eventually. He paused. Kept looking back until they carried the man out of sight. Evan glanced toward Kelso. The old dog was lying with one forepaw across Walter's shoe. Bad working habit, Evan said. Terrible, Walter smiled. Good character flaw. The phrase caught Evan unexpectedly. Good character flaw. He was used to flaws being problems to correct. During his Coast Guard years, weaknesses were cataloged because weaknesses killed people. Hesitation, overconfidence, poor judgment under cold stress, tunnel vision. You identified the failure, you trained against it. Walter seemed to be describing something that had made Kelso less efficient and more trustworthy at the same time. After he retired, Walter continued, I fostered old dogs for a rescue now and then. Nothing dramatic, usually somebody's 12-year-old mutt whose owner died, or a dog that needed a quiet month before placement. What did Kelso think of that? Maeve asked. He picked whichever one looked worst and slept beside it. Walter shook his head. People used to tell me I'd taught him to rescue things. His hand moved slowly over Kelso's head. I taught him to search. Staying was always his. For several seconds, Evan heard only the soft hum of the heater near the window. The sentence unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. He had spent his own career being taught when to go in and when to withdraw. When the swimmer entered the water, when the basket went up, when the survivor belonged to medical instead of rescue. The handoff had always mattered. Kelso seemed built around the refusal to believe a handoff was complete until someone weaker was truly safe. Maeve broke the silence. I've been trying to remember something. Walter looked over. What? North window. Evan straightened slightly. That's what I wanted to ask. He took the folded road map from his jacket and placed it on the table. We traced Kelso to the Green Lantern Resort. He and Juniper stayed there long enough to use the food in the maintenance shed. When it ran low, they left. Walter looked over the route. There were closer places, Evan continued. Homes, a service station, a farm supply store. Sure. But he kept going to Maeve's restaurant. Walter did not study the map for long. His face changed before his eyes reached North Window Grill. Then he leaned back. Well, hell. Maeve narrowed her eyes. What? You really don't remember? Apparently not. For years after winter training around Willoughby, I stopped at your place. Maeve blinked. With Kelso? With Kelso. Recognition arrived slowly, then all at once, oh! Walter smiled. There she is. Maeve looked at Kelso. You were the dog who slept behind my kitchen door. Kelso opened one eye. Evan looked between them. Maeve pointed at Walter. You always ordered black coffee and whatever pie was oldest. Discount pie. You called it discount after eating it. Walter shrugged. And you, Maeve said, looking down at Kelso, used to lie beside the heat vent until I brought water. Roast beef, Walter corrected. Water first. Roast beef eventually. Even Graham laughed. Maeve's expression softened as the memories rearranged themselves. She remembered winter evenings when Walter and Kelso came in after training. Sometimes the dog had snow frozen along his belly. Sometimes both of them smelled of wet pine and cold air. Kelso usually stayed near the back entrance because he was working. Maeve gave him water, occasionally scraps. Mostly, she left him alone, where the kitchen heat escaped through the wall vent. Walter tapped the map. To him, your place meant we were done. Evan looked at him. Done? Search finished, gear off, warm room, water, food, nobody missing. Walter looked toward Maeve. It was one of the places he learned nothing bad happened next. The words settled differently than Evan expected. He had been looking for navigation, distance, scent memory, trail familiarity. All of that mattered. But the route had been emotional before it was geographical. Kelso had not chosen the nearest building. He had chosen a remembered place where, repeatedly, people had been safe. Maeve seemed to reach the same conclusion. He didn't come for the kitchen. Walter shook his head. No. He looked at the dog beside him. When that little pup couldn't keep going, Kelso took her to the one place left in his head where people had opened the door before. Evan thought again of the restaurant window. Kelso standing outside, Juniper beneath him. The bowl of food he had pushed toward her. He had assumed the shepherd arrived at North Window because hunger finally overpowered caution. Now the scene meant something else. Kelso had not simply arrived. He had completed a decision. Walter looked at Evan. He could have kept looking for me. The comment was quiet. Evan said nothing. He knew old routes. He knew Graham. He probably knew enough country to keep trying. Walter looked toward Kelso. But he found that puppy. A faint smile crossed his face. And that became the job. That was the moment something inside Evan shifted, not dramatically. There was no revelation that corrected his life, only an uncomfortable comparison. Kelso had been moving toward something he knew. Then a weaker creature appeared, and he changed direction. Evan had spent years perfecting the opposite instinct, finish the task, make the handoff, continue. He had always considered that discipline. Now he wondered how often discipline had become a convenient name for departure. Maeve opened the paper bag. You're all getting melancholy on an empty stomach. Walter accepted a slice of coffee cake. Graham did too. The room moved back toward ordinary conversation. That mattered. Evan noticed more and more that the deepest moments rarely stayed deep for very long in real life. Someone needed coffee. A knee hurt. A dog shifted position. Crumbs fell onto a cardigan. Maybe that was part of staying too. Not living forever at the emotional peak. Remaining after it passed. Eventually, the question everyone had avoided had to be asked. What happens with Kelso? Graham said. Walter stopped chewing. For the first time that afternoon, he looked old. Not physically, in the eyes. I want him back. No one answered. Walter placed the plate on the side table. I need to say that first. His hand returned to Kelso's shoulder. I want my dog back. Kelso lifted his head at the word dog. Walter smiled weakly. But wanting it doesn't make it right. Graham shifted forward. You could try. No. Walter pointed toward the folded walker. My balance is bad. Hip is worse when the weather changes. Kelso weighs what? 75 pounds when he's healthy? Around that, Evan said. If he pulls because a squirrel insults him, I'm on the floor. He doesn't chase squirrels, Graham said. Walter gave him a look. You've missed the point beautifully. Maeve covered a smile. Walter gestured around the room. This place allows animal visits. They'll tolerate a little lapdog in certain units. They're not set up for him full-time, and even if they were, he looked down. Kelso deserves walks longer than the hallway. The words did not come easily. Evan could see that. Walter rubbed the black fur along Kelso's neck. I spent years asking him to do what was best for somebody else. His fingers stopped. Would be pretty selfish to stop doing the same now. Graham stared at the floor. Maeve said nothing. Evan felt the room drawing toward a familiar kind of sadness, one that expected a profound final sentence. Walter refused to provide it. Instead, he sighed. Also, he sheds like a collapsed mattress. Maeve laughed first, then Graham. Walter smiled. Even Evan felt the pressure break. A few minutes later, however, Walter looked at Evan directly. Keeping him because I miss him isn't love. The humor had gone, not the warmth. Sometimes love is admitting somebody needs more than you can give. Evan looked toward the snowy hills outside. He thought of people he had left because there had been someone else to take over. Then he thought of Marianne. Not with longing, with clarity. There had been years when both of them had stayed in a marriage because leaving felt like failure, even though neither one was truly present anymore. Maybe leaving and abandoning were not synonyms. Maybe staying and loving were not either. When it was time to go, Walter did not ask for another hour. That told Evan more about him than the stories. He gripped the armrests and pushed himself upright. Graham moved automatically to help. Walter waved him off until balance forced him to accept an elbow. Kelso stood beside him. Walter removed a small brushed brass SAR tag from beneath Kelso's collar, turning it once between his fingers. He did not take it off, not yet. Instead, he let it fall gently back against the oxblood leather. Not today, Walter murmured. Evan heard him but did not ask. That choice belonged to another moment. Walter bent as far as his body permitted and placed both hands around Kelso's head. You go. Kelso stayed. Walter nodded toward Evan. Go on. Kelso took 2 steps, stopped, returned to Walter, pressed his muzzle once against the man's knee. Walter closed his eyes. Then Kelso walked back to Evan. No command the second time. At the doorway he turned once. Walter had sat down again. His hand rested over the brass, tag-shaped empty place in his palm, even though the tag was still on Kelso's collar. Evan waited. He did not pull the leash. Eventually, Kelso turned forward on his own. Outside, the winter afternoon had grown bright and cold. Maeve and Graham walked toward their vehicles. Evan opened the SUV door and helped Kelso climb onto the rear seat. Before closing it, he looked back toward the window. Walter was there, one hand raised. Kelso saw him. His tail moved once against the blanket. Then he settled. On the drive south, North Window Grill appeared between the trees just before sunset. Golden windows, snow on the roof, smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still air. Kelso lifted his head. His ears came forward. He watched the building as they passed. Evan slowed without thinking. A week earlier, he would have called it a restaurant. Now he understood what Kelso had remembered. Not roast beef, not warmth alone. A pattern. Work ended there. Water appeared. A familiar woman opened a door. Nobody asked him to protect anything for a while. Evan kept driving. "Yeah," he said quietly. Kelso looked toward him through the gap between the seats. "I get it now." For Kelso, North Window Grill had never simply been somewhere to eat. It was a place where the world had repeatedly proven safe enough to rest. And when Juniper needed such a place more than he did, Kelso had remembered how to get there. 2 weeks changed Juniper quickly. Puppies had a way of making recovery look almost disrespectfully easy. The cinnamon and cream pup, who had once fit weakly beneath a fleece blanket, now treated the cottage as if she had signed the lease herself. She discovered chair legs, bootlaces, the loose corner of a kitchen rug, and the deeply important fact that snow could be eaten faster than Evan could tell her not to. Kelso recovered differently. His ribs were less visible. The black saddle across his back had regained some shine. He could walk the length of the yard without the support harness most mornings, and had begun putting more weight on his rear legs. But improvement did not erase age. After a few minutes outside, Kelso slowed. After getting up from sleep, his first steps were stiff. Sometimes Juniper bounced around him with the thoughtless optimism of the very young, while Kelso simply stood and waited for her energy to become reasonable. It never did. Evan found himself watching the contrast. Juniper looked forward because there was almost nothing behind her. Kelso seemed to carry every mile. Corinne came by on a Thursday afternoon with a clipboard. Evan knew before she spoke that this was not a social visit. "You found homes." "I found possibilities." She took off her navy parka and hung it near the door. Juniper attacked one bootlace. Corinne removed it from her mouth without interrupting the conversation. 3 inquiries for the puppy since yesterday." "That fast?" "She's young, healthy, small enough to look harmless in photographs." Juniper bit Corinne's shoelace again. Corinne glanced down. "Misleading, obviously." Evan almost smiled. "And Kelso?" Corinne sat at the table. "That is harder." There was a retired working dog program in New Hampshire willing to evaluate him. They had handlers experienced with older shepherds, fenced acreage, and access to veterinary rehabilitation. On paper, it sounded excellent. There was one problem. "They won't take Juniper," Corinne said. Evan leaned against the counter. "And the puppy applicants won't take Kelso." One couple asked. Then they saw his medical notes and realized what a 9-year-old working dog actually requires. "That's fair." "It is." Evan expected Corinne to argue. She did not. That bothered him. He had begun to notice how often reasonable decisions felt worse than unreasonable ones. The strongest application for Juniper came from Tom and Elise Carver, a married couple in their 50s who lived about an hour away near Morrisville. They had owned dogs for years. Their last one had died the previous spring at 14. They had a fenced yard, flexible schedules, stable finances, and no interest in turning a rescue puppy into a symbol of their goodness. Corinne liked them. That mattered. "They sound fine," Evan said. "They are." "So we let them meet her." Corinne studied his face. "You're very efficient today." "That was the goal." "Was it?" Evan ignored the question. The meeting happened Saturday. Tom Carver was 56, tall and slightly stooped, with a receding hairline and the cautious hands of someone who knew dogs did not always want to be touched immediately. Elise was 53, compact and warm-faced, with silver beginning at the temples of her dark hair and an old waxed coat patched at one elbow. They did not rush Juniper. That was the first thing Evan respected. They sat on the living room floor and waited. Juniper made them earn her interest for approximately 30 seconds. Then she climbed into Elise's lap, stole one glove, and fell sideways against Tom's leg. "Traitor," Evan muttered. Corinne heard him. "You said efficient." "I still am." Kelso lay near the doorway. He watched, not with alarm. Not yet. Tom scratched Juniper under the chin. "We really like her." Elise looked toward Kelso. "And him too." "But?" Evan asked. Tom exhaled. "Our house is one level. Yard's good. But I work 3 days a week out of town." Elise nodded. "And my mother lives with us. She's steady, but not steady enough for a large dog if he gets underfoot. We could manage a puppy." "But not Kelso." "No." There was no shame in the answer. Evan liked them more for saying it plainly. Corinne suggested a short trial exercise, nothing official, just 5 minutes outside with Juniper near the Carvers' parked SUV while Kelso remained inside with Evan. They wanted to see how both dogs handled temporary separation. Elise clipped Juniper's leash to a lightweight harness. The puppy strutted toward the door as though leaving home for a better offer. Evan opened it. Cold air rushed in. Juniper bounced down the steps with Tom and Elise. Kelso rose. That was all. No bark, no whining, no scramble for the door. He simply stood. Evan closed the door. Kelso moved to the window, his eyes fixed on Juniper. Outside, she attacked a clump of snow. Tom laughed. Elise crouched beside her. Everything looked fine. Kelso did not move. Evan watched his shoulders. Too high. His mouth closed. His breathing shallow. "Kelso." No response. The Carvers reached the SUV. Juniper disappeared briefly behind the rear door as Elise opened it. Kelso's front legs began to tremble. Evan felt the change before he understood it. It was not the weakness from the first week. That had started in the hindquarters. This was tension. The dog stood so rigidly that his muscles shook under the coat. Evan stepped beside him. "They're right there." Kelso stared through the glass. The SUV door closed, only for a few seconds. Kelso backed away from the window, then forward again. His nails clicked once against the floor. Corinne was already watching from the kitchen. "Open the door," she said. Evan did. "Tom!" The trial ended immediately. No drama, no argument. Elise brought Juniper back up the steps. The moment the puppy crossed the threshold, Kelso's entire body changed. Not joy. Release. His mouth opened. His shoulders dropped. He smelled Juniper once from nose to tail, then turned away and lay down. Juniper climbed partly over his front leg and began chewing a piece of rope. Tom looked uncomfortable. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," Corinne said. "You barely did anything at all." Elise looked at Kelso. "Then what happened?" Corinne sat on the arm of a chair. "He spent days behaving as though her survival depended on him." She kept her voice practical. "No human was consistently present, no predictable routine. If she disappeared, he had reason to think something bad could happen." Tom frowned. "But he knows she's safe here." "He knows she has been safe while he can monitor her." Evan looked at Kelso. That distinction struck harder than expected. Corinne continued. "We don't fix that by forcing him through it." "So they can't be separated?" Elise asked. "Not today." "Ever?" Corinne shook her head. "I didn't say that." She looked at Kelso. "He needs to learn that care can continue when it isn't coming from him." The sentence stayed with Evan long after the Carvers left. They handled the disappointment well. Elise knelt before Juniper, kissed the top of her head, and said they would wait. No promise, no claim, just wait. After the SUV disappeared, Evan stood at the window. Kelso was asleep already, actually asleep. Juniper lay against his side. Evan understood something uncomfortable then. Kelso's loyalty was beautiful only from a distance. Up close, it was exhausting. The dog had made himself responsible for a life he could not fully control. That was not simply devotion. Part of it was fear. Over the next several days, Corinne gave Evan a routine, not separation, practice. Juniper spent 3 minutes in the bedroom with the door open while Kelso remained in the kitchen. Then 5 minutes with the door mostly closed. Then 10 while Evan sat beside Kelso and Juniper played with a toy in the next room. At first, Kelso listened to every sound. His ears tracked footsteps, his eyes remained open. By the 4th day, he lowered his head. By the 6th, he slept through 7 minutes. Evan did not celebrate. He had learned Kelso disliked fuss. Instead, he poured coffee and pretended not to notice. Progress, he discovered, often looked insultingly small. That same afternoon, his phone rang. Virginia. Evan saw the company name and knew exactly why they were calling. He stepped onto the porch before answering. Cold sunlight reflected off the yard. "This is Lattimer." The project manager got to the point. A marine inspection contract had opened near Norfolk. 2 weeks, possibly 3. Good rate, straightforward work. They wanted Evan on site in 5 days. Normally he would have accepted before the man finished describing the vessel. Instead, Evan looked through the cottage window. Juniper was dragging one of his socks across the floor. Kelso lay near the radiator. His head was down. He was not watching her. 5 days. Evan could pack in an hour. He had done it hundreds of times. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. There was a pause. "You need to check your schedule?" "Yes." Another pause. The man on the line knew Evan well enough to find that answer strange. "All right." Evan hung up. He stayed on the porch. For the first time in years, a good contract felt less like opportunity and more like interruption. That annoyed him. He went inside and saw the cottage properly. The drying towel Maeve had loaned him hung over the radiator. 2 water bowls sat against the kitchen wall. Juniper's tiny winter booties, most of which she hated, were lined crookedly beside the door. Dog hair clung to the sleeve of Evan's rust-brown jacket. A bag of food occupied the space where his inspection manuals had been. The cottage looked untidy, used, inconvenient, alive. He had spent years avoiding evidence that a place expected him back. Now the evidence was everywhere. That evening, Marianne called. Evan had mentioned Kelso in a message earlier that day without realizing he had done it. Not the shepherd, not the foster dog. Kelso. Marianne noticed things like that. "How's your temporary dog?" "Still temporary." "Of course." "And the puppy?" "Also temporary." "I admire your commitment to the word." Evan sat at the table. Juniper slept beneath it. Kelso was near the stove. "I got offered Virginia." "When?" 5 days. "You taking it?" "I don't know." There was a short silence. Marianne did not fill it. That had always been one of her more dangerous qualities. She knew how to leave a question where it was. "I could take Kelso to the working dog program," Evan said. "Juniper has applicants." "Okay." "They'd both be fine." "Sounds like it." He frowned. "You're not helping." "You didn't ask for help." Evan looked toward Kelso. The shepherd had stretched out on his side. A month ago, Evan would have called that nothing. Now he knew the difference between resting and guarding. Kelso was resting. "I'm thinking about staying," Evan said. Marianne was quiet long enough for him to regret saying it. Then she asked, "Why? For the dogs?" "No." He straightened. "No?" "No." Her voice remained calm. "Don't stay because two animals make you feel useful." "That isn't what I said. It's what you've done your whole life." Evan rubbed one hand over his beard. Marianne continued. "You know how to sacrifice. You know how to respond. You know how to be the man everybody is relieved to see when something goes wrong." He stared at the floor. "Those are good things, yes? Doesn't sound like it when you say them. They are good things, Evan. They just aren't the same thing as building a life." Juniper stirred beneath the table. Kelso's ear moved. His eyes remained closed. Marianne's voice softened. "Don't stay because you want to prove you're a good man." Evan said nothing. "Stay only if you're willing to be there when nobody needs rescuing." The cottage became very quiet. No accusation lived in the sentence. That made it impossible to fight. Evan looked around. An ordinary evening. No storm, no wounded animal outside a window, no urgent drive to a veterinarian, no person waiting to be pulled from cold water. Juniper was asleep. Kelso was safe. Nothing required heroism. And Evan was still there. "That sounds harder," he said. Marianne gave a small laugh. "It was for you." He smiled despite himself. After the call ended, Evan remained at the table. The Virginia contract waited on his phone. So did Corinne's message about the retired dog program. Two clean solutions. Two places willing to take responsibility. Nobody was trapped. Nobody would die if Evan drove south. That should have made the decision easy. Instead, Kelso woke, stood, crossed the room, and lowered himself near Evan's chair. Not touching him, not asking for anything. Juniper stayed asleep across the room. Kelso did not check her. Evan noticed that too. The dog was learning. Maybe that was the real problem. Kelso was learning how not to carry everything alone. Evan had not decided whether he could do the same. He looked at the phone again. 5 days. For most of his adult life, 5 days had been enough time to leave anywhere. Now, for the first time, Evan wondered whether leaving was still the easier choice simply because he had practiced it longer. Maeve had mentioned the cottage behind North Window Grill 3 times before Evan realized she was serious. The first time she pointed through the kitchen window while carrying a tray of coffee mugs. "That place needs someone stubborn." Evan had looked at the small timber house beyond the parking lot. "Looks like it needs a contractor." "Same thing sometimes." The second time she mentioned the rent. The third time she put a ring of keys beside his coffee. That got his attention. The cottage had belonged to her father. After he died, Maeve used it for storage, then occasionally for summer staff. Over the years, one thing after another had gone wrong, and simply remained wrong. The porch sagged slightly at the left corner. A section of fence had collapsed beneath a fallen branch. 2 exterior outlets no longer worked. The kitchen light flickered when the refrigerator cycled on. None of it made the place unlivable. It only made it obvious that nobody had committed to it. Evan stood on the porch one afternoon with Maeve while snowmelt dripped from the eaves. "You want me to rent this?" "I want someone to stop complaining about the wiring and fix it." "I haven't complained. You looked at the panel for 12 seconds. Same thing." He glanced toward the yard. It was larger than the cottage he was currently renting. Enough room for dogs. Close to the restaurant. 10 minutes from Corinne's clinic. The road was plowed reliably. Too convenient. Evan had learned to distrust convenience when it began resembling permanence. "What's the catch?" "Month to month at first. Less rent if you handle some repairs." "That's not much of a catch." Maeve shrugged. I'm getting old. I'm losing my touch. He looked at the roofline. If I replace that porch beam, fix the fence, inspect the electrical, and reseal the back steps, you're getting the better end of this. Good. You admit it? I own a restaurant. Of course I admit it. Evan almost smiled. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. Virginia. He did not answer. Maeve noticed. She said nothing. That was worse. I'm not staying, Evan said. Maeve slid the keys back into her apron pocket. I didn't ask you to. You just offered me a house. I offered you a lease. That's usually how staying starts. Maeve looked at him for a long second. No, Evan. Staying starts when you stop treating every door like an exit. He gave her a flat look. That sounded rehearsed. It wasn't. If I'd rehearsed it, it would have been meaner. He left without the keys. That should have settled it. It did not. The next morning brought the kind of winter weather that made Vermont seem almost forgiving. The sky was bright and clean after fresh snow. Sunlight turned every branch white and sharp. The wind had dropped. Even the cold felt less hostile. Evan brought Kelso and Juniper to North Window before breakfast service. Maeve let them use the fenced strip behind the restaurant while she opened the kitchen. Juniper had reached the stage of recovery where nobody could remember how recently she had been fragile. She launched herself into the snow, not gracefully, with conviction. Her legs punched through the powder. She disappeared to the chest, scrambled out, ran 3 more steps, and immediately lost traction. Evan folded his arms. She's going to hurt herself. Maeve stood beside him holding a mug. She's a puppy. That's not a defense. It's the entire defense. Juniper tried to change direction too quickly. Her back feet slid sideways. She rolled once and landed in a shallow drift. Kelso moved immediately. Not fast, but with the old reflex intact. He had been standing near the porch, head up, watching. The instant Juniper went down, he stepped forward. 1, 2, then stopped. Juniper's head popped out of the snow. She sneezed violently. Evan waited for Kelso to continue toward her. He did not. Juniper pulled herself upright. For a second, she stood there, powdered white across the muzzle, deeply offended by winter. Then she ran back, straight to Kelso. She pressed her shoulder against his chest and shoved her nose beneath his jaw. Kelso remained still. Juniper bounced away, returned, bumped him again. This time Kelso's tail moved. Not the single careful sweep Evan had seen with Walter. A real wag, small, rusty, almost reluctant, but unmistakable. Juniper spun in a circle as though she had achieved something. Kelso followed her 3 steps, then 4. She ran around him. He turned, slowly. For half a minute, the old German shepherd did something Evan had not seen since finding him. He played. Barely. No sprinting, no rough chase. Only a soft, sideways movement, a lowered head, a brief lift of the front paws when Juniper darted past him. But it was enough. Maeve lowered her coffee. Well. Evan said nothing. The image unsettled him differently from the first days. He had grown used to thinking of Kelso as the strong one, the protector, the body between danger and something smaller. But Juniper no longer needed him every second. And instead of making Kelso unnecessary, that seemed to give something back to him. Juniper was not only the life he had saved, she was becoming part of the life he still had. The difference mattered. Evan watched Kelso stop near the fence. Juniper immediately sat beside him. For once, neither looked like a patient. Neither looked like a rescue. They looked like dogs. That should have been ordinary. It felt important. Later that morning, Graham arrived with Walter. The assisted living community allowed Walter several hours away, as long as someone transported him and he used his walker on uneven ground. Graham had turned the visit into an operation large enough to require blankets, a thermos, 2 extra cushions, and enough concern to irritate Walter before he had even stepped out of the truck. "I'm 67, Walter complained. "You fell in November." "I was there." Graham opened the passenger door. "Then you remember." Walter looked at Evan. "See what happens when people care about you? Ruins everything." Evan helped steady the walker. "I've been warned." They sat on the old cottage porch because Walter wanted to see the place Maeve had been talking about. The sun reached the boards for most of the afternoon, making the temperature tolerable beneath coats and blankets. Kelso settled at Walter's feet. Juniper wandered between everyone, collecting attention like tacks. For a while the conversation stayed practical: roof pitch, fence posts, whether the porch could be leveled or should simply be rebuilt. Graham argued for rebuilding. Evan argued that Graham enjoyed creating work because he did not have to pay himself. Maeve brought coffee. Walter watched all of it with a faint smile. Then his hand moved to Kelso's collar. The oxblood leather had been cleaned but not replaced. It was softer now, though age still showed in every crease. The small brass SAR tag remained beneath Kelso's throat. Walter turned it between thumb and forefinger. The metal was scratched enough that the lettering caught light unevenly. He had almost removed it during their last visit. Almost. This time he unclipped it. No announcement, no ceremony, just a tiny metallic sound. Kelso looked up. Walter held the tag in his palm. "You know what this means?" Graham shifted in his chair. Kelso did not. Walter smiled. "Good." He rubbed the dog behind one ear. "You don't need to work anymore." Juniper trotted up and put both front paws on Walter's boot. Walter looked at her. "You especially are not an assignment." Juniper tried to chew his shoelace. "Terrible employee." Maeve laughed. Walter closed his fingers around the tag. For the first time, Kelso's collar looked strangely plain. Evan had not expected the missing piece of brass to change the dog. It did not. That was the point. Kelso remained Kelso. Working title removed. Duty removed. Worth unchanged. Evan felt the thought before he wanted it. For years he had measured himself through usefulness. Rescue swimmer, inspector, the man who knew what to do when machinery failed or weather turned bad. Remove the task, and what remained? He had never liked the question. Walter seemed less afraid of it. Kelso stood. He walked toward Evan, stopped beside him, then turned back toward Walter. For a moment, Evan expected the dog to choose. The idea embarrassed him as soon as it occurred. Kelso walked halfway back and lay down between the two men. His body angled so that he could see both. Walter looked at Evan. "Dogs are better at this than we are." At lying in the middle? At understanding that moving forward doesn't require pretending nothing came before. Evan looked down at Kelso. Walter continued. "He can love me and go home with you." The word home landed before Evan could stop it. "This isn't my home."
Walter looked around the unfinished porch.
"Could have fooled me." "I don't live here." "Not yet." Maeve pretended to become very interested in the coffee pot. Evan shook his head. "You people are coordinated." "No," Walter said. "We're old. Looks similar." Graham laughed. The moment passed. But the word did not. Home. Evan had spent so long using temporary language that even the noun felt intrusive. Rental, contract, room, place. Never home. He looked through the porch railing. Juniper had wandered into the yard. Kelso remained between Walter and Evan. No anxiety. No need to monitor every step she took. The puppies slipped in the snow again. Kelso lifted his head. Juniper stood up by herself. Kelso lowered it. Progress. quiet enough that most people would miss it. By late afternoon, Walter grew tired. Graham packed the cushions back into the truck. Before leaving, Walter tucked the brass SAR tag into the inside pocket of his cardigan. Evan noticed. "You keeping it?" Walter patted the pocket. "Unless he asks for it back." Kelso was busy smelling a snowbank. Walter's smile faded into something gentler. "Some things you retire, some things you keep." Evan understood. They said goodbye without making it final. Walter scratched Kelso's cheek. Graham promised to return Tuesday with lumber estimates. Maeve went back inside for dinner prep. Evan remained on the porch. His phone buzzed. Virginia again. This time he answered. "Lattimer." The project manager sounded relieved. "We need a decision." Evan looked at the cottage, the bad porch, the fence leaning under snow, the window trim that needed scraping in spring. There was nothing beautiful about the repairs. That was what made them real. "You should give it to someone else." Silence. "You sure?" Evan looked toward Kelso. The shepherd stood in the yard while Juniper circled him. "Yes." "Something better come up?" The question was casual. Evan almost answered no. Instead, he said, "Something different." "All right. We'll keep you in mind for the next one." "I'd appreciate it." The call lasted less than a minute. No music, no speech, no dramatic goodbye to his old life. Evan slipped the phone into his pocket. Nothing in the world visibly changed. That surprised him. He had expected regret, a sense of doors closing. Instead, he noticed the cold creeping through the porch boards into his boots, a loose gutter bracket, a rusted screw near the railing. Juniper trying to dig beneath the fence, immediate things. Maeve came out through the kitchen door carrying a garbage bag. She saw his face. "What did you do?" "Turn down Virginia." She stopped. "You sure?" "Yes." Maeve studied him. He appreciated that she did not congratulate him. "Well," she said, "that was either growth or terrible financial judgment." "Probably both." She carried the bag toward the dumpster. Evan called after her. "The cottage." Maeve turned. "The roof, specifically." "What about it?" "How bad?" Maeve's mouth curved. "Bad enough to keep you from running off for a few months?" Evan looked at the porch above him. That was almost a sales pitch. "I'm improving." He laughed. Not the half smile she had pulled from him the first day. A real laugh. It surprised him enough that he stopped midway through it. Maeve noticed but did not comment. Again. That evening, Evan took the keys. He did not move in, not yet. There were papers to sign, repairs to inspect, arrangements to make with Corinne regarding Kelso and Juniper. There were still decisions ahead, but for the first time, he stood inside the empty cottage without automatically calculating how quickly he could pack out of it. Kelso walked through the doorway behind him. Juniper followed. The puppy immediately discovered a loose scrap of wallpaper near the baseboard. "No." Evan pulled it from her mouth. Kelso sat in the middle of the room. The bare walls reflected the last pale winter light. Evan looked at the three of them in the darkened window. A man. An old working dog, without a working tag. A puppy that no longer needed to be carried. Nothing about the image looked permanent yet. That was all right. Permanence, Evan was beginning to understand, was not a promise made in advance. Sometimes it started much smaller, with a set of keys you did not return. Chapter 6. A house that was no longer a stopover. Maeve had mentioned the cottage behind North Window Grill 3 times before Evan realized she was serious. The first time she pointed through the kitchen window while carrying a tray of coffee mugs. That place needs someone stubborn. Evan had looked at the small timber house beyond the parking lot. Looks like it needs a contractor. Same thing sometimes. The second time she mentioned the rent. The third time she put a ring of keys beside his coffee. That got his attention. The cottage had belonged to her father. After he died, Maeve used it for storage, then occasionally for summer staff. Over the years, one thing after another had gone wrong and simply remained wrong. The porch sagged slightly at the left corner. A section of fence had collapsed beneath a fallen branch. 2 exterior outlets no longer worked. The kitchen light flickered when the refrigerator cycled on. None of it made the place unlivable. It only made it obvious that nobody had committed to it. Evan stood on the porch one afternoon with Maeve, while snowmelt dripped from the eaves. "You want me to rent this?" "I want someone to stop complaining about the wiring and fix it." "I haven't complained. You looked at the panel for 12 seconds. Same thing." He glanced toward the yard. It was larger than the cottage he was currently renting. Enough room for dogs, close to the restaurant, 10 minutes from Corinne's clinic. The road was plowed reliably. Too convenient. Evan had learned to distrust convenience when it began resembling permanence. "What's the catch?" "Month to month at first."
Less rent if you handle some repairs.
"That's not much of a catch," Maeve shrugged. "I'm getting old. I'm losing my touch." He looked at the roof line. "If I replace that porch beam, fix the fence, inspect the electrical, and reseal the back steps, you're getting the better end of this." "Good. You admit it?" "I own a restaurant. Of course I admit it." Evan almost smiled. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. "Virginia." He did not answer. Maeve noticed. She said nothing. That was worse. "I'm not staying," Evan said. Maeve slid the keys back into her apron pocket. "I didn't ask you to." "You just offered me a house." "I offered you a lease." "That's usually how staying starts." Maeve looked at him for a long second. "No, Evan. Staying starts when you stop treating every door like an exit." He gave her a flat look. That sounded rehearsed. It wasn't. If I'd rehearsed it, it would have been meaner. He left without the keys. That should have settled it. It did not. The next morning brought the kind of winter weather that made Vermont seem almost forgiving. The sky was bright and clean after fresh snow. Sunlight turned every branch white and sharp. The wind had dropped. Even the cold felt less hostile. Evan brought Kelso and Juniper to North Window before breakfast service. Maeve let them use the fenced strip behind the restaurant while she opened the kitchen. Juniper had reached the stage of recovery where nobody could remember how recently she had been fragile. She launched herself into the snow. Not gracefully, with conviction. Her legs punched through the powder. She disappeared to the chest, scrambled out, ran 3 more steps, and immediately lost traction. Evan folded his arms. She's going to hurt herself. Maeve stood beside him holding a mug. She's a puppy. That's not a defense. It's the entire defense. Juniper tried to change direction too quickly. Her back feet slid sideways. She rolled once and landed in a shallow drift. Kelso moved immediately. Not fast, but with the old reflex intact. He had been standing near the porch, head up, watching. The instant Juniper went down, he stepped forward. 1, 2, then stopped. Juniper's head popped out of the snow. She sneezed violently. Evan waited for Kelso to continue toward her. He did not. Juniper pulled herself upright. For a second she stood there, powdered white across the muzzle, deeply offended by winter. Then she ran back, straight to Kelso. She pressed her shoulder against his chest and shoved her nose beneath his jaw. Kelso remained still. Juniper bounced away, returned, bumped him again. This time Kelso's tail moved. Not the single careful sweep Evan had seen with Walter. A real wag, small, rusty, almost reluctant, but unmistakable. Juniper spun in a circle as though she had achieved something. Kelso followed her 3 steps, then 4. She ran around him. He turned, slowly. For half a minute, the old German shepherd did something Evan had not seen since finding him. He played. Barely. No sprinting, no rough chase, only a soft sideways movement, a lowered head, a brief lift of the front paws when Juniper darted past him. But it was enough. Maeve lowered her coffee. "Well," Evan said nothing. The image unsettled him differently from the first days. He had grown used to thinking of Kelso as the strong one, the protector, the body between danger and something smaller. But Juniper no longer needed him every second. And instead of making Kelso unnecessary, that seemed to give something back to him. Juniper was not only the life he had saved, she was becoming part of the life he still had. The difference mattered. Evan watched Kelso stop near the fence. Juniper immediately sat beside him. For once, neither looked like a patient. Neither looked like a rescue. They looked like dogs. That should have been ordinary. It felt important. Later that morning, Graham arrived with Walter. The assisted living community allowed Walter several hours away, as long as someone transported him and he used his walker on uneven ground. Graham had turned the visit into an operation large enough to require blankets, a thermos, 2 extra cushions, and enough concern to irritate Walter before he had even stepped out of the truck. "I'm 67, Walter complained. "You fell in November." "I was there." Graham opened the passenger door. "Then you remember." Walter looked at Evan. "See what happens when people care about you? Ruins everything." Evan helped steady the walker. "I've been warned." They sat on the old cottage porch because Walter wanted to see the place Maeve had been talking about. The sun reached the boards for most of the afternoon, making the temperature tolerable beneath coats and blankets. Kelso settled at Walter's feet. Juniper wandered between everyone, collecting attention like tacks. For a while, the conversation stayed practical. Roof pitch, fence posts, whether the porch could be leveled or should simply be rebuilt. Graham argued for rebuilding. Evan argued that Graham enjoyed creating work because he did not have to pay himself. Maeve brought coffee. Walter watched all of it with a faint smile. Then his hand moved to Kelso's collar. The oxblood leather had been cleaned but not replaced. It was softer now, though age still showed in every crease. The small brass SAR tag remained beneath Kelso's throat. Walter turned it between thumb and forefinger. The metal was scratched enough that the lettering caught light unevenly. He had almost removed it during their last visit. Almost. This time he unclipped it. No announcement, no ceremony, just the tiny metallic sound. Kelso looked up. Walter held the tag in his palm. "You know what this means?" Graham shifted in his chair. Kelso did not. Walter smiled. "Good." He rubbed the dog behind one ear. "You don't need to work anymore." Juniper trotted up and put both front paws on Walter's boot. Walter looked at her. "You especially are not an assignment." Juniper tried to chew his shoelace. "Terrible employee." Maeve laughed. Walter closed his fingers around the tag. For the first time, Kelso's collar looked strangely plain. Evan had not expected the missing piece of brass to change the dog. It did not. That was the point. Kelso remained Kelso. Working title removed, duty removed, worth unchanged. Evan felt the thought before he wanted it. For years he had measured himself through usefulness, rescue swimmer, inspector, the man who knew what to do when machinery failed or weather turned bad. Remove the task and what remained? He had never liked the question. Walter seemed less afraid of it. Kelso stood. He walked toward Evan, stopped beside him, then turned back toward Walter. For a moment, Evan expected the dog to choose. The idea embarrassed him as soon as it occurred. Kelso walked halfway back and lay down between the two men, his body angled so that he could see both. Walter looked at Evan. "Dogs are better at this than we are." "At lying in the middle?" at understanding that moving forward doesn't require pretending nothing came before. Evan looked down at Kelso. Walter continued, "He can love me and go home with you." The word home landed before Evan could stop it. "This isn't my home." Walter looked around the unfinished porch. "Could have fooled me. I don't live here." "Not yet." Maeve pretended to become very interested in the coffee pot. Evan shook his head. "You people are coordinated." "No," Walter said. "We're old. Looks similar." Graham laughed. The moment passed. But the word did not. Home. Evan had spent so long using temporary language that even the noun felt intrusive. Rental, contract, room, place. Never home. He looked through the porch railing. Juniper had wandered into the yard. Kelso remained between Walter and Evan. No anxiety. No need to monitor every step she took. The puppy slipped in the snow again. Kelso lifted his head. Juniper stood up by herself. Kelso lowered it. Progress. Quiet enough that most people would miss it. By late afternoon, Walter grew tired. Graham packed the cushions back into the truck. Before leaving, Walter tucked the brass SAR tag into the inside pocket of his cardigan. Evan noticed. "You keeping it?" Walter patted the pocket. "Unless he asks for it back." Kelso was busy smelling a snowbank. Walter's smile faded into something gentler. "Some things you retire. Some things you keep." Evan understood. They said goodbye without making it final. Walter scratched Kelso's cheek. Graham promised to return Tuesday with lumber estimates. Maeve went back inside for dinner prep. Evan remained on the porch. His phone buzzed. Virginia again. This time he answered. "Lattimer." The project manager sounded relieved. "We need a decision." Evan looked at the cottage. The bad porch. The fence leaning under snow. The window trim that needed scraping in spring. There was nothing beautiful about the repairs. That was what made them real. "You should give it to someone else." Silence. "You sure?" Evan looked toward Kelso. The shepherd stood in the yard while Juniper circled him. "Yes." "Something better come up?" The question was casual. Evan almost answered no. Instead, he said, "Something different." "All right. We'll keep you in mind for the next one." "I'd appreciate it." The call lasted less than a minute. No music, no speech, no dramatic goodbye to his old life. Evan slipped the phone into his pocket. Nothing in the world visibly changed. That surprised him. He had expected regret, a sense of doors closing. Instead, he noticed the cold creeping through the porch boards into his boots. A loose gutter bracket. A rusted screw near the railing. Juniper trying to dig beneath the fence. Immediate things. Maeve came out through the kitchen door carrying a garbage bag.
She saw his face.
"What did you do?" "Turn down, Virginia." She stopped. "You sure?" "Yes." Maeve studied him. He appreciated that she did not congratulate him. "Well," she said, "that was either growth or terrible financial judgment." "Probably both." She carried the bag toward the dumpster. Evan called after her, "The cottage!" Maeve turned. "The roof, specifically." "What about it?" "How bad?" Maeve's mouth curved. "Bad enough to keep you from running off for a few months." Evan looked at the porch above him. That was almost a sales pitch. "I'm improving." He laughed, not the half-smile she had pulled from him the first day, a real laugh. It surprised him enough that he stopped midway through it. Maeve noticed but did not comment. Again. That evening, Evan took the keys. He did not move in, not yet. There were papers to sign, repairs to inspect, arrangements to make with Corinne regarding Kelso and Juniper. There were still decisions ahead. But for the first time, he stood inside the empty cottage. without automatically calculating how quickly he could pack out of it. Kelso walked through the doorway behind him. Juniper followed. The puppy immediately discovered a loose scrap of wallpaper near the baseboard. "No!" Evan pulled it from her mouth. Kelso sat in the middle of the room. The bare walls reflected the last pale winter light. Evan looked at the three of them in the darkened window. A man, an old working dog without a working tag, a puppy that no longer needed to be carried. Nothing about the image looked permanent yet. That was all right. Permanence, Evan was beginning to understand, was not a promise made in advance. Sometimes it started much smaller, with a set of keys you did not return.
3 months later, winter had not left Vermont so much as loosened its grip. Snow still lay deep along the north sides of barns and stone walls, but the days had lengthened. By noon, water ticked steadily from roof edges. Roads that had once been packed white now showed dark ribbons of pavement between slush. The hills around Willoughby remained bright under snow, but the light had changed. Spring had not arrived. It had simply begun sending notice. The cottage behind North Window Grill looked different too. The porch no longer leaned. Graham had replaced the worst section of railing and spent 2 Saturdays arguing with Evan about fence posts until Maeve threatened to charge both men for the coffee they were using to prolong the disagreement. The broken section of yard fence stood straight now. The electrical panel had been inspected, 2 circuits replaced, and the kitchen light no longer flickered whenever the refrigerator started. Evan had painted nothing. Maeve accused him of being afraid of color. He told her paint was cosmetic.
She informed him that this was exactly the sort of sentence spoken by men who owned 6 gray shirts. He still had not painted anything. But he had stayed. That part surprised him less now. His work had changed without disappearing. Evan still inspected boats, safety systems, pumps, hull fittings, and emergency equipment. He still traveled when necessary, but no longer accepted every contract simply because it existed somewhere else. Most of his work now came from marinas and small commercial yards within driving distance. Sometimes he left before sunrise. Usually he returned by dinner. People knew where to call him. More unsettling, they expected him to answer. He had discovered that routine did not feel like confinement once he stopped treating it as a threat. Kelso had filled out noticeably, not back into the powerful SAR dog Walter remembered, and Evan was glad of that. There had been too much temptation in the early weeks to measure recovery by how closely Kelso resembled his younger self. Corinne had corrected that idea. "He is not recovering toward 9 years ago," she had said. "He is recovering toward a healthy 9-year-old dog now." So Evan learned to notice the right things. Kelso rose without needing the support harness. He finished meals without stopping every 30 seconds. He could walk the fence line twice before tiring. His coat had regained its deep, warm gold beneath the black saddle, and the narrow cream marking down his chest showed clearly now that the fur was clean and full. He still moved stiffly after long naps. Cold mornings still slowed his hips, and he had developed an intense appreciation for the rug in front of the stove. Retirement suited him. Juniper seemed determined to make sure retirement was not peaceful. At nearly 6 months old, she had grown into long legs, oversized ears, and an alarming belief that every household object had been placed specifically for her investigation. She stole gloves, moved Graham's tools, once dragged Maeve's red and white kitchen towel halfway across the yard and buried it beneath the porch. Maeve discovered the crime 2 days later. "Your dog owes me a towel. She is not my dog when she commits felonies. She lives in your house. So does Kelso. Kelso has standards." Kelso, lying in the sun nearby, gave no indication that he wished to be involved. The most important change was quieter. Corinne had asked Evan to bring Juniper to the clinic alone one afternoon for vaccinations. He had expected Kelso to follow them to the door. Kelso had looked up from his bed. Juniper left with Evan. The door closed. Kelso remained where he was. When Evan returned nearly 2 hours later, Kelso met them in the kitchen with a wagging tail and a thorough inspection of Juniper's ears. No pacing, no shaking, no frantic checking. Corinne called it progress. Evan thought the word was too small. Kelso had spent weeks believing that Juniper's safety depended entirely on his presence. Now he could sleep while she was gone. The dog had learned something Evan had only recently begun to understand himself. Caring for someone did not require holding every piece of their life in your own hands. Sometimes trust was allowing the door to close and believing it would open again. On Tuesdays, Graham often appeared after lunch. He claimed to be checking the fence. The fence had not needed checking in 6 weeks. Evan stopped pointing that out. Graham brought lumber, bolts, spare hinges, or some other object that gave him an excuse to stay. The folding carpenter's ruler was always visible in the pocket of his work coat. He talked less than he had during the first weeks. That was probably the clearest sign he was doing better. His guilt over losing Kelso had not vanished. Evan doubted real guilt ever vanished simply because somebody explained that forgiveness was available. But Graham no longer apologized to Kelso every time he saw him. Instead, he complained when Kelso lay directly where he needed to work. That seemed healthier. "You're blocking the level." Kelso did not move. Graham looked at Evan. "He used to respect me." "Did he?" "No, but Walt was around to pretend he did." Walter visited every second Sunday when weather and energy allowed. Graham usually drove him. Sometimes Maeve picked him up if Graham was busy. No one treated the trips like important occasions. That was part of what made them important. Walter would arrive with his ash cane, complain about the steps, then sit at his old preferred table inside North Window Grill. Kelso always knew before the front door opened. The first sign was usually the ears. Then the head came up. Then Kelso crossed the floor at a dignified pace that became slightly less dignified in the final few feet. Walter always said the same thing. "You again?" Kelso always pressed against his knee. The brass SAR tag Walter had removed remained in his room at the assisted living community. The oxblood collar stayed on Kelso. No replacement tag, no new title, no ceremony assigning him to Evan. Walter never said, "He is yours now." Evan never needed him to. Whatever relationship had formed between them did not require ownership language every time they entered a room. Juniper adored Walter for less philosophical reasons. He dropped food. The visits ended with Graham helping Walter into the truck, Kelso standing nearby, and everyone saying some version of, "See you next time." No one called it goodbye. Evan liked that. It made separation ordinary rather than tragic. Corinne found another use for him too. One afternoon, she called while Evan was checking an emergency pump on a fishing boat. "I need a favor." "That sentence has cost me before." "Old Labrador needs transport to a foster home in Barrie." "Why me?" "Your SUV is already covered in dog hair." "That is not a qualification." "It is today." He drove the Labrador. Then, 2 weeks later, an elderly Belgian Malinois retired from security work. Then a shepherd mix whose owner had entered hospice and whose temporary foster was nervous about handling a large dog alone. Evan did not start a nonprofit, did not print business cards, did not allow Maeve to call it your rescue thing. It was simply useful work that happened to fit between inspections. He liked that no one applauded. The dogs went from one safe place to another. Evan drove home. That was enough. One late afternoon, light snow began to fall. Not storm snow, large, slow flakes that vanished on the wet pavement and rested briefly on the older snowbanks. North Window Grill was between lunch and dinner service. The room was quiet enough that Maeve had turned the radio down. Evan sat at the same table beside the front window where he had eaten soup 3 months earlier. He had not chosen it for symbolism. At least, that was what he told himself. Kelso lay under the table on a folded wool blanket. Juniper slept with half her body pressed against his side and one back leg stretched impossibly far into the aisle. Evan drank black coffee and reviewed an inspection schedule on his tablet. Nothing dramatic was happening. He had begun to value that. The front door opened. A man in his 40s entered, stamped snow from his boots, and waited while Maeve brought a menu. He looked toward the dogs, then looked again. Is that him? Maeve followed his gaze. That depends. The shepherd. The one people were talking about this winter. Maeve glanced at Kelso. Probably. The man stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. The dog from outside the window? Evan looked up. He had never loved being discussed in the third person while present. Kelso appeared entirely unconcerned. The stranger nodded toward the glass. My sister said she saw him that day. Said he was standing out there with a puppy. Maeve wiped the counter with her familiar towel. That was him. The man looked beneath the table. Juniper opened one eye, decided he had nothing useful, and went back to sleep. That the puppy? Yes. Hell. His expression softened, then he looked toward Evan. Did he rescue them? Maeve did not answer immediately. Evan returned his attention to the tablet. He could feel her looking at him. That was irritating. Finally, Maeve said, At first. The man waited for more. Maeve did not provide it. Coffee? She asked. He seemed to realize the story was over. Sure. When he walked toward the counter, Evan looked at Maeve. At first? She poured coffee. You prefer a longer explanation? I prefer no explanation. You sat at the famous table. This is a table, of course. Evan shook his head. Underneath it, Juniper shifted. Kelso lifted his head. The movement was slow. He checked the puppy once, then looked toward the window. Snow drifted past the glass. 3 months earlier, Kelso had stood on the other side. Evan could still remember the first clear image, a large dog made narrow by hunger. Wet black and gold fur. A puppy lowered carefully onto snow. Kelso positioning his body against the wind. At the time, Evan had understood the situation in the simplest possible terms. Cold animals, warm building, transport, veterinarian, problem, solution. He knew better now. Getting someone out of danger was often only the beginning. Juniper had survived the storm. Then she had needed food, routine, vaccinations, boundaries, patience. Kelso had survived too. Then he had needed rest, trust, medical care, and permission to stop acting as though every life near him depended solely on his vigilance. Evan had needed something less obvious. There had been no emergency room for it. No checklist, no clean handoff. He had needed to learn how to remain after usefulness became ordinary. The stranger at the counter was telling Maeve something about a cousin who had once owned a shepherd. Evan barely heard him. Kelso shifted again. His hips were stiff against the floor. Evan set the tablet aside, leaned down, and pulled the wool blanket farther beneath the old dog's rear legs. Kelso looked up. No gratitude, no drama, just acceptance. Evan preferred that. Juniper used the movement as an invitation to crawl farther onto Kelso and place her chin across his ribs. Kelso exhaled. Evan smiled. Outside, the snow thickened slightly. For a moment, the glass reflected the interior more strongly than the world beyond it. Maeve behind the counter. Walter's empty chair at the table he used on Sundays. Graham's truck visible near the side lot because he had apparently found another fence problem that did not exist. Evan at the window. Kelso beneath him, Juniper asleep against Kelso. A collection of ordinary things. The sight would have frightened him once, not because it was bad, because it could be lost. For years he had treated impermanence as protection. If you never planted yourself deeply, nothing could uproot you. It was a convincing theory. It was also a lonely one. His phone buzzed. A local marina. Evan checked the message. Pump inspection Monday morning, 8 o'clock. He typed back, "I'll be there." Then placed the phone face down. Not, "I can fit it in before I leave." Not, "Send the address." He knew the marina. He knew the road. And afterward, he knew where he was coming back to. Kelso had come to North Window Grill because memory told him that someone there had once opened the door. He had not needed to understand kindness as a philosophy. He remembered its pattern: warmth, water. A familiar voice. A place where the work ended and he was allowed to rest. Years later, when Juniper could no longer keep up, Kelso had used that memory for someone other than himself. Evan had once thought that was the rescue. He no longer did. The rescue had continued afterward. Through meals no one applauded, appointments, separation training, fence repairs, a declined contract, Walter learning to love Kelso from a different address, Graham learning not to make one mistake his permanent identity, Kelso learning that Juniper could leave a room and still come back, and Evan learning that a day did not need a disaster to deserve his presence. Maeve crossed the room and topped off his coffee without asking. "You're staring." "I'm thinking." "Dangerous." Evan looked outside. The exact patch where Kelso had once stood was covered by a thin layer of new snow. No marker, no sign. People walked over it without knowing. That seemed right. Not every important place needed a plaque. Some only needed to remain open. Evan put one hand on Kelso's shoulder. The shepherd's breathing moved beneath his palm, warm, steady. Juniper continued sleeping. There was nothing left to save in that moment. And Evan did not feel useless. That was new. He leaned back in the chair. Outside the window, Vermont winter was slowly becoming spring. Inside, an old working dog slept without a job. A puppy slept without fear. And a man who had spent most of his life arriving for emergencies finally understood the quieter part of rescue. Sometimes getting someone out of danger was only the first act of love. The harder part was building a life in which they no longer had to be rescued at all. Kelso had remembered the way to a door. Evan had finally learned what to do after opening it. He stayed. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is not rescuing someone from one terrible moment, but choosing to remain when the crisis is over. Kelso remembered a place where a door had once opened for him. Evan learned that a meaningful life can begin the same way, by opening the door, making room, and staying long enough for trust to become ordinary. In our own lives, we may not be called to dramatic rescues. Sometimes we are simply called to be present for someone who needs patience, consistency, and a safe place to return to. If this story stayed with you, share what it meant to you in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, second chances, and the quiet choices that change a life. May you always find an open door when you need one, and have the courage to keep one open for someone else.